Israel struck Lebanon again after the MoU. Iran said, then the deal is already off. So Iran closed Hormuz again. JD Vance is trying to keep the diplomacy alive. Trump is threatening to bomb Iran again. And Tehran is basically saying, go ahead, threaten. We already tested that gun. This is not just another Middle East crisis. This is a stress test of American power. Can Washington restrain Israel? Can it force Iran to comply? Can it keep oil moving? Can it threaten war and negotiate peace at the same time? Because right now, America is trying to be the mediator, the enforcer, Israel's shield, Iran's coercer, the oil market stabilizer, and the global hegemon at once. That used to work when everyone believed the gun was loaded. Now Iran is listening to the click and asking, where's the bullet? There is a historical mirror here, and it is not a small one. In 1956, Egypt's leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. That canal was not just a ditch with water in it, it was one of the main arteries of global trade and oil movement. Britain and France still thought of themselves as imperial powers. They believed they could use military force to restore control. So Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation against Egypt. On the battlefield, they could still hit hard. They could still bomb. They could still move troops. The old imperial gun still made noise. But politically, the gun no longer worked. The United States refused to back them. The Soviet Union threatened escalation. Financial pressure hit Britain. The pound came under stress. Suddenly, London discovered something brutal. You can win the operation and still lose the system. Suez exposed the gap between tactical power and strategic authority. Britain and France could still break things, but they could no longer decide the rules. That was the moment the world saw that the old empires still had weapons but no longer had the same command over the international order. Now look at Hormuz. The United States can still strike Iran. Nobody serious denies that. But can it strike Iran, keep Hormuz open, keep Israel restrained, keep Gulf allies calm, prevent an oil shock, avoid a wider regional war, and still get Iran to sign the MoU? That is the real question. Because if the answer is no, then Hormuz becomes America's Suez moment. Not because America is weak, because power is not just the ability to fire. Power is the ability to make the whole system obey after you fire. And that brings us to today's mess. One government in Washington trying to negotiate, another faction trying to threaten, Israel trying to keep the pressure on, and Iran turning Hormuz into the enforcement mechanism. There is an old line usually attributed to Al Capone. You can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than with a kind word alone. There is also the cleaner statecraft version from Theodore Roosevelt. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Same basic logic. Less Chicago sausage factory. But both versions depend on one thing. The other side must believe the gun actually works. That is where the current American problem begins. The White House diplomatic wing is trying to convert the Hormuz battlefield mess into a signed framework. JD Vance is acting like the deal manager. He is working really hard trying to get the MoU to survive long enough to become something real. The framework is simple enough on paper. De-escalation, navigation, oil movement, sanctions relief, nuclear limits, regional restraint, and a return to something that looks like controlled diplomacy. But then Israel strikes Lebanon. Iran says, wait a minute, Lebanon was part of the deal. If Israel keeps hitting Lebanon, then the first point of the MoU is already being violated. So Iran closes Hormuz again. That is not random rage. It is structured retaliation. Iran is saying if Washington cannot restrain Israel, then Washington cannot expect Iran to keep the strait open. Maritime access becomes conditional on political enforcement. And here is the part that matters most. Trump did not publicly turn around and say, Israel, stop striking Lebanon because this breaks my deal. Instead, he threatened Iran again. Iranian negotiators then reportedly left or suspended the talks after Trump threatened renewed strikes if Iran did not control pro-Iranian groups in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Vance was still trying to claim progress and keep diplomatic channel alive. So what message does Tehran hear? Vance says, we can make a deal. Trump says, we may still bomb you anyway. Israel says, we will keep striking Lebanon. Washington says, everybody calm down while we threaten everybody. That is not strategy. That is an empire trying to drive with four people holding the steering wheel. This does look like an institutional contradiction in Washington, D.C. There is several factions moving at once and their incentives do not match. The first faction is the diplomatic one. They want a deal because the war is now damaging the broader American system. Oil is under pressure, shipping is under pressure, allies are nervous, inventories are thin, insurance risk is growing, inflation risk is rising, military depletion is real, and nobody in Washington wants gasoline pain turning into political pain. This faction understands that a war with Iran is not Iraq 2003. Iran has missiles, drones, geography, proxies, industrial depth, and Hormuz. It can make the whole region expensive very quickly. The second faction is the Israel-aligned faction. They want pressure on Iran to continue because any deal that leaves Iran standing looks like a strategic defeat for Israel. For Israel, the issue is not just nuclear enrichment, it is regional rank. There can be only one dominant regional power in the Middle East, like in the movie Highlander. There can be only one. If Iran survives the war, keeps its missile capacity, keeps its regional levers, and keeps a deal with Washington, then Israel does not just face a military problem, it faces a status problem. That is why Lebanon matters. Israel is not only hitting Hezbollah, it is testing whether the American-Iranian framework can actually restrain Israeli military freedom. The third faction is the Trump personality. Trump wants both peace and domination theater. That is the problem. He wants the signature. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize optics. He wants to say, I ended the war. He wants the deal maker trophy. But at the same time, he wants to sound like Zeus throwing lightning bolts from Truth Social. So instead of Vance's diplomacy being strengthened by presidential discipline, it gets undercut by presidential theater. Trump thinks a threat adds leverage. But in this case, it may subtract credibility because Iran does not hear America is strong. Iran hears the negotiator does not control the principle. That is poison in any negotiation. In business terms, imagine you are negotiating a contract with a company vice president while the CEO stands outside yelling that he might burn down your warehouse. You don't sign, you call security. The fourth faction is the military and operational faction. They probably know the hard limits better than anyone. They know what can be struck. They know what cannot be held. They know what resupply looks like. They know what naval escalation costs. They also know what happens if Hormuz becomes a sustained mine, drone, missile, and insurance nightmare. They also know the difference between destroying targets and achieving political obedience. That distinction is everything. The United States can still hit Iran. Of course it can. It can destroy facilities. It can kill commanders. It can blow stuff up. It can blockade. It can sanction. It can seize assets. It can pressure banks, pressure insurers. It can hurt Iran badly. The gun exists. They get it. But the gun is no longer a magic wand. The question is not, can America hit Iran? Of course it can. The real question is this: can America hit Iran, keep Hormuz open, keep Israel restrained, keep Gulf allies calm, prevent an oil shock, avoid a wider regional war, avoid military depletion, and still get Iran to sign the MoU? That is where the gun jams. Not tactically, strategically. The United States can still break things, but breaking things is not the same as conjuring the political outcome you want. That is the Afghanistan and Iraq lesson in one sentence. And apparently, a few figures in Washington need to finally learn that. The old American intimidation model was simple. We offer you a deal. Behind the deal is a carrier group. Behind the carrier group is financial isolation. Behind financial isolation is regime change fear. That worked against smaller or more isolated countries. It worked against Iraq, Libya, Serbia, Panama. It worked even against many Gulf states in some softer form. You didn't need to fire the gun if everyone believed the gun was locked and loaded. But Iran has now tested that gun. It absorbed the US Israeli strikes, and yet it retained command structure. It retained missile capacity. It retained regional levers. It turned Hormuz into a counter pressure mechanism. It made Lebanon a compliance trigger, and now, crucially, it is showing that Trump's threats no longer create automatic submission. That is the shift, because a US threat created fear. Now, a US threat creates Iranian escalation and global South observation. That is a serious loss of coercive credibility, and the global South is watching carefully. They're not mainly watching who is morally right. That is for speeches, conferences, and NGO brochures. They are watching practical things. Can Washington enforce the behavior of its own allies? Can Washington force Iran to comply without blowing up the energy system? Can Washington protect global trade while threatening the very actor controlling the choke point? If the answer is no, then the US security guarantee becomes less absolute, not useless, not dead, but very conditional. That is the big test. Iran is not just testing America for itself. Iran is providing a live demonstration to Saudi Arabia, China, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, and everyone else. Look carefully. The Americans can threaten, but can they deliver without setting their own house on fire? That is why Hormuz matters more than another missile exchange. Iran's Lebanon move is structurally clever because it changes the issue from Iran is closing a global waterway to the United States cannot enforce the first point of its own agreement. That is a legitimacy trap. If the US says Israel has the right to strike Lebanon, Iran says then your MoU is fake. If the US tells Israel to stop and Israel ignores it, Iran says you cannot control your client. If the US threatens Iran instead of Israel, Iran says you're not a guarantor, you're a co aggressor. If the US attacks Iran again, the deal dies and Hormuz becomes the battlefield. That is the box. And it is a much better box than simply firing missiles at American bases. It forces Washington to review whether it governs the system or merely narrates it. This is why Trump's threat makes the diplomacy worse. Threatening Iran now is not like threatening a small country with no retaliation ladder. Iran has already proven that escalation hurts others immediately: shipping, oil, Gulf states, insurers, US allies, and probably Trump's domestic gasoline politics. So when Trump threatens, he may think he is adding leverage. In reality, actually, he may be subtracting credibility from Vance. Vance says, we can make a deal. Trump says, we may bomb you anyway. Iran hears the American negotiator does not control the American decision maker. And once that happens, why would Iran ever make any concessions? Why reopen Hormuz simply because Trump barks orders louder? From Iran's point of view, the leverage is working. Hormuz puts pressure on Washington. Lebanon puts pressure on the MoU. Israeli strikes expose the gap between American promises and American control. Trump's threats expose the gap between American diplomacy and American coercion. Iran does not need to win a conventional war to win this round. It only needs to make American enforcement look unreliable. That's enough. So, what was the situation? The United States and Iran tried to build a transactional MoU: sanctions, oil, navigation, and nuclear limits in exchange for regional de escalation. What did it become? Israel tested the deal through Lebanon. Iran responded through Hormuz. Trump tried to restore dominance through threats. Vance tried to preserve the diplomatic track. Iran used the contradiction to question whether Washington can actually enforce anything. Where does it lead? Unless Washington restrains Israel in Lebanon or gives Iran a visible concession, Iran has no incentive to reopen Hormuz just because Trump raises his voice. The likely next phase is not immediate full war. It is coercive bargaining through controlled disruption. Iran intermittently tightens Hormuz. Israel intermittently strikes Lebanon. Vance keeps trying to patch the paper. Trump keeps performing the threat theater. Markets price in instability. The global south watches whether the US guarantee still functions. And the blunt conclusion is this: the MOU is not failing because Iran doesn't want peace. It is failing because the US is trying to be mediator, enforcer, Israel's shield, Iran's coercer, oil market stabilizer, and global hegemon all at the same time. That used to work when everyone feared the gun. Now Iran is saying, "We heard the click. Where's the bullet?" This is a wrap for today, my friends, and I'll see you next week.